responsibilities and accountabilities of communicators and journalists. Freedom of speech. It is one of the basic rights of communicators and journalists. Freedom of expression is a concept that encourages the freedom of a person or group without fear of punishment, censorship, or legal penalty to express their views and ideas. Restraint is one of the primary responsibilities and accountabilities of communicators and journalists. Prudence, choosing one's word carefully in both oral and written communication. It is also the ability to govern and discipline oneself with the use of reason. Libel is defamation using printed and written words. Libel includes the act of publishing statement about an individual that is untrue and seeks to damage that credibility. Slander is an oral declamation. Slander, also known as the oral or spoken defamation. Slander is the legal term for the act of damaging the reputation of a person, saying something about that person that is untrue and harmful to one or more of the other people.
Moral dilemmas and communication practice. So when we say moral dilemma, it is a situation in which a difficult choice has to be made between two courses of action. Communicators and journalists often deal with moral conflicts as they perform their duties. So, habang do sa mga communicators and journalists, ilang mga duty is kanang nag-deal po na sila og kanang mga moral conflicts. Accordingly, this involve the following. Sanders 2003. Conflicts of interest. It is the first moral conflict. In their desire to obtain information, communicators and journalists may be tempted to accept freebies, including gifts and free trips. So, as a journalist, mag-gather man jud ta og information. Then, pag nakakuha na ka og information about a certain nga issue, na ay po'y other nga journalist nga moduol sa imuha para makakuha og information sa imuha. But through giving gifts or freebies, mo na ilahang ways para maka-istorya ka sa imuhang mga information about sa certain issue. Then second is treatment of sources. Communicators and journalists need to take note of where they get information. They need to be careful in suing questionable or problematic information. So, mag-gather daw og information, kailangan jud mag-take note kung ahagi kan ang information. Then, kailangan pod nga careful ta ini mag-ask og problematic information sa ato ang gi-interview. Then, third is methods. Communicators and journalists may be tempted to conduct ambush interviews and engage in deception and other similar practices to obtain information. So, dariya is ang way po dariya para makakuha og information ang journalist is kanang mag-conduct sila ambush interview, which is ang ilahang interviewon is walay idea about nga issue nga imong i-ask sa ila, and kaning engage in deception means kanang mag-mislead siya or mag-promote og idea nga dili tinuod para lang makakuha og makakos na mo to siya ang cause pag kanang mag-conduct og kanang ambush interview para lang makakuha og information. Then last is level of publicity. Communicators and journalists need to observe limits in promoting transparency and awareness. They have to be cautious when it comes to reporting on certain matters, such as the sexual life of a politician or a public figure. So, as a journalist man, kailangan og confidentiality ang imuhang gi-interview, especially about anang sexual life sa politician or public figure. Kay kuan pag dili ta cautious sa atoang mga gina-report nga information is pwede na siya maka-harm o maka-cause og damage sa isa ka life sa isa ka politician or public figure.
The Code of Ethics for Journalists. In the Philippines, communicators are governed by the Code of Ethics of their respective organizations, especially journalists and broadcasters. The Philippine Press Institute and the National Press Club jointly created a Code of Ethics for Philippine journalists. So when we say ethics, it is a moral principles of certain individuals, organizations, especially the journalists and the broadcasters. Some of the essential elements of the code are the following. So there are 5 essential elements for the Code of Ethics of Journalists. So first, thoroughness. Journalists must emphasize the necessary information in the reports and prevent twisting the facts to serve their own objectives or those of an organization. They also need to correct errors in the reporting immediately. So as a journalist, kaya dapat facts information lang ang provide sa public. So if there is an error, so ila jud nang gina-check dayon aron valid ang ilang pag-report. The second one, transparency and respect for confidentiality. Journalists should uphold transparency and avoid hiding information, especially when it concerns public interest. However, they should respect the confidentiality of certain information, especially if this will harm the safety of certain individuals. So, journalists, dapat ang gina-provide ng information sa public kay facts lang jud og dili nga mga opinion lang jud nila. Pero napuyuban nga kanang journalist nga dili jud nila ingon sa public kay namatay ginatawag ang confidentiality of an information. The third one, fairness, honesty, and originality. When gathering and presenting information, journalists need to consider all sides of an issue. They should avoid catering to their interests or those of a specific person or organization. Journalists must avoid plagiarism. So fairness. So dapat jud na equality nga ginatawag as a journalist. So dili jud ta nga kanang mupanig lang ta sa isa ka tao, dapat jud panigan ay para na to ang duwa ka buok, dili lang ta mo kuan diri ako sa positive nga side, dapat both side mo panig ang isa ka journalist, dili lang kay gusto niya ni nga buhatag story mo na dayon iyang himuan. So originality. So sa journalist natay ginatawag nga kanang 5 Ws. So ang 5 Ws man na siya ang what, where, when, why, what, where, when, how, why, who, and 1H, which is ang how. So dapat jud mag-avoid sa plagiarism and makasunod sa mga terms sa journalist. So decency, integrity, and dignity. Journalists must avoid offending others when reporting or gathering information. Decency, integrity, and dignity must also be reflected in the task the journalist accept. So as a journalist, dapat gikanang atong ginabato sa atuang sinulat kay good, dili maka-apekto sa dili siya maka-offend sa mga tao o in terms sa reporting. Cautiousness. Journalists should be cautious with the information they release. For example, they must be careful in stating the names of women and minors involved in crime. So, di ba mapansin nato pag mag-report kanang sa crime or rape, kaya na sila kanang na nickname kanang murag alias. So, dapat sad kay kanang kabalo jud sila nga maging cautious sa labi na sa mga information nga gina-provide nila sa public.
The guiding principles for the journalists. The Code of Ethics for Journalists reflects certain principles in the profession. McBride and Rosenstiel of 2013 discuss the guiding principles for journalists, which are meant to meld the core values of journalism with the democratic values of the digital era. Since journalists are providing current and relevant information to the citizens, they must follow these guiding principles for them to become an effective one. So the first principle is the pursuing the truth. Journalists must ensure accuracy in the information they report. They should be honest and objective in both gathering and presenting information. So in articles or news, a journalist must assure that every piece of information that he will write down are credible. And of course, the rule is to inform the public. That's why they need to be the truth seekers. Dili dapat sila magkumpiyansa og balita because they are providing us valid and credible information about the happenings or the events in our society. The second one is upholding transparency. Journalists must inform the audience of their sources to gain their trust. They must also be transparent about their mistake and correct them immediately. So the second one is the upholding transparency, which means kung magbalita, kailangan kabaluta ng mga audience kung asagikan or kinsa ang ilang mga sources kay para mas mutuota sa ilang ginabalita. And if ever they said some mistakes, it is the responsibility to correct it immediately kay para dili mag-cause of panic, misunderstanding, fake news, or misinterpretation. The third one is the serving community as their ultimate goal. Journalists should be aware of the needs of the community and they constantly collaborate with its members. Doing so can help journalists to gather and report information without harming or offending them. And of course, ang mga journalists kay need connection sa mga member of society. Kailangan siya para makagain of more information without offending the people. And journalists must also practice compassion and empathy and avoid serving the interests of private corporations and disempowered communities. And if you are a journalist, dapat dili ka bias o dili ka mag-base according lang sa imong feel or magpakita ka na naa ka ginadapigan. Dapat pantay-pantay, walay pagdapig-dapig if you want to be an effective one. And finally, journalists should encourage members of the community to seek and report information themselves. They should collaborate not only with journalists themselves but with one another. Ang mga journalists, dili lang dapat sila mag-stick or magsalig og kuhang information sa ilang mga kapwa na journalist. They need to gather information sa public because the more connections, the greater information they will collect. Mao ang kasagaran sa mga journalist kay tabian, friendly ug hawad makigstorya sa mga tao.